I've been told that retirement is supposed to feel like coasting downhill after a long climb, quiet mornings, fishing rods leaning against the shed, coffee cooling on the porch rail. For me, that peace came late. I'm a widower now, and though the silence in my lakeside home sometimes feels too heavy, I find comfort in the steady ripple of water against the dock, the whisper of wind through the cypress trees. My grandfather, yes, 90 years old and still sharper than a tack, lives 2 doors down. After my wife passed, he moved into this same retirement village. Not many people can say they get to share their golden years with the man who raised them, but I count it as one of life's last blessings. He's the kind of man who'll sit on his porch at dawn, cap pulled low, saluting the rising sun like, "It's an old friend." But peace doesn't last long when there's an HOA. Now, I know many of you watching have dealt with your fair share of HOA revenge stories, homeowners association drama, and the endless pettiness that comes with community standards. But nothing prepared me for what was coming. It started with a knock at my grandfather's door. I was already on my way over with a thermos of coffee. Grandpa likes his black, strong enough to peel paint. Through the window, I spotted her, the HOA president, the kind of woman the internet would immediately christen a Karen. Blonde bob haircut, oversized sunglasses perched like a crown, clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a badge of honor. Even from a distance, I could see her lips curling in disgust. Grandpa answered in his usual way, slow, calm, with a twinkle in his eye. "Morning, Mom, can I help you?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Yes, you can help. You can start by removing that flag." I froze mid-step, coffee nearly spilling down my shirt. She was pointing at the American flag that hung from a simple bracket on Grandpa's porch column. Faded, sure, it had been through rain, storms, and years, but it was still sturdy, still proud. Grandpa tilted his head. "That flag's been with me since Korea. Carried it home. Raised it. Every day I could. Don't see how it bothers anyone." Karen clicked her pen like a weapon. "The bylaws state that no personal displays larger than 3 feet by 5 feet are allowed without prior approval. This thing," she practically spat the word, "is oversized and non-compliant." Now, folks, let me pause here. What do you think? Should a man who gave his youth to this country be forced to take down his own flag because some HOA rulebook says so? Comment below. I want to hear if you think she's being fair, or if this is the kind of nitpicking that makes people hate HOAs. Back on the porch, Grandpa straightened. His spine might be bent with age, but his pride never was. "Ma'am, that flag's not going anywhere, not as long as I'm breathing." Karen smirked. "Then you'll be fined, $50 a day until it's removed. Consider this your first warning." She slapped a paper onto his porch table, turned on her heel, and marched down the walkway. I finally stepped up beside Grandpa, setting the coffee down. His hand trembled just slightly as he picked up the violation notice. Not from fear, but from something far more painful, humiliation. Imagine being told at 90 years old that the very symbol you bled for was now non-compliant. He looked at me and muttered, "Guess I'm a criminal now." That line, it hit me like a gut punch. And I knew, in that moment, we weren't just dealing with one petty complaint. This was war. For the next few days, it seemed like Karen had a personal vendetta. She circled his house like a hawk, wrote him up for a wind chime being too loud, for his lawn chair being too visible, even for the way he stacked his firewood. Neighbors whispered about it at the clubhouse. Some shook their heads in sympathy, others kept their distance. Nobody wanted to be her next target. But here's the thing Karen didn't know. My grandfather may have been old, but he wasn't alone. He had friends, old friends, men who had worn the same uniforms, who carried scars you couldn't always see, and when they heard what was happening, they started showing up. One by one, his military buddies filled his porch. They sat there like sentinels, sipping coffee, swapping stories, keeping him company. It was a sight that made Karen's jaw tighten every time she passed, but still, the fines kept coming. Day after day, envelopes slid into his mailbox. The HOA was determined to break him down, to force him to submit. But let me tell you, when you've survived frozen nights in a foxhole, you don't break that easy. I began collecting the notices, lining them up on my kitchen counter like pieces in a puzzle. And the more I read, the more something felt off. The bylaws were being twisted, stretched, and flat-out ignored. And here's your first twist, folks. Pattern interrupt number 1. While I was reading through the fine print, I realized something shocking. The HOA president wasn't even properly elected. That's right. She had assumed the role after the last president passed away, but the board never held the required vote. She wasn't an HOA president. She was a squatter in power. Now tell me this, should we have gone straight to a lawyer at that point, or played it smart and waited? What would you have done in our shoes? That night, Grandpa and I sat on the porch, the lake reflecting the stars like a mirror. He was quiet, too quiet. Finally, he said, "Son, I can fight battles, but I'm too old to fight a war of paperwork." I put a hand on his shoulder. "Then I'll fight it for you, and we'll win the right way." The game had changed. Karen thought she was fighting one old man, but she was about to learn she'd picked a fight with an entire brotherhood. And me, I was ready to expose her fraud to the whole community. What do you think? Should a 90-year-old veteran be forced to take down his flag? Would you have gone straight to a lawyer or waited to gather proof? Have you ever dealt with an HOA that abused its power? The morning after that discovery, that Karen wasn't even a properly elected president, I walked to Grandpa's porch with a folder tucked under my arm. Inside were every violation notice, every fine, every piece of paper she'd stuffed into his mailbox. He was sitting there, cap low over his brow, sipping his coffee in silence. "Morning," I said, sliding the folder onto the table. "Thought you'd want to see what we're up against." Grandpa thumbed through the stack, his hands steady now. "Good grief," he muttered. "I've had court-martials with less paperwork than this." But even as he tried to joke, I could see the wear on him. The fines weren't just numbers. They were arrows meant to wound his pride. $50 here, $75 there. Every one of them carried an insult beneath the ink. And the thing about insults is, they spread. By the end of the week, Karen wasn't just targeting Grandpa anymore. She had started walking around with her clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge, picking on anyone who so much as had a lawn gnome or a misplaced flower pot. But the difference was, with Grandpa, she went for the jugular. One morning I caught her snapping photos of his old pickup truck. It wasn't much to look at. Rust kissed the edges, and the paint had dulled to a soft grey. But that truck had hauled wood, groceries, even fishing rods for decades. "Non-compliant vehicle," she announced when I confronted her. "No unsightly automobiles may be visible from the road. It's in the bylaws." I laughed, sharp and bitter. "Unsightly? That truck's got more history than this whole neighborhood combined." She didn't even blink. "Then keep it in. The garage or the fines will double." Folks, here's where I need your take. Is an old truck really worth fining someone over? Or is this just another case of HOA revenge stories spiraling out of control? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I guarantee this part will split the audience. That night, I sat with Grandpa at the kitchen table. His hands rubbed over the fines, one after another, like sandpaper on old wood. Finally, he looked at me and said, "It's not about the money. It's about the shame. She's trying to make me feel like I don't belong here." That line, "like I don't belong here," cut me deeper than anything else. Because that's what HOAs like Karen's thrive on, humiliation. They don't just want your money, they want your obedience. But here's where the story takes its first big turn. Remember how I said Grandpa had friends? Well, they weren't just any friends. They were men and women who had spent decades in uniform. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Retirees who had chosen this lakeside village because it offered peace, fishing, and a bit of community. When word got around that Karen was harassing Grandpa, something shifted. Suddenly, his porch wasn't just a porch, it was headquarters. On a Wednesday morning, 6 of them showed up. By Friday, it was a dozen. By the end of the week, I counted nearly 20 retirees lined up in lawn chairs, sipping coffee, telling stories, and making their presence known. Karen hated it. She tried to walk past with her clipboard, chin high, pretending they weren't there. But the sight of 20 veterans quietly saluting Grandpa's flag every morning made her face tighten like a clenched fist. And here's where the first audience retention moment kicks in. One of those veterans, a man named Hank, tall, broad-shouldered, still carrying himself like a drill sergeant, leaned over to me and said, "Son, I think it's time we reminded her how elections are supposed to work." He explained that the HOA bylaws required an annual election for board positions. Karen had skipped it twice, meaning technically she wasn't president at all. Now imagine how sweet the irony is here. The very bylaws Karen used like a whip could become the noose around her authority. But Karen wasn't backing down. The next week, Grandpa received a notice that nearly made my blood boil. According to her, his porch chairs violated the uniform community aesthetic. The fine, $200. When I confronted her, she smirked. If he can't keep up with the standards, maybe this isn't the right place for him. That's when I snapped. The man fought for this country when you were still in diapers. He's the reason you have the freedom to make rules in the first place. Karen just smiled, the kind of smile that said she thought she'd already won. Rules are rules. If he doesn't like it, he can sell. Folks, let me pause here and ask, what do you think about her line, "Maybe this isn't the right place"? For him, fair enforcement or pure cruelty? That night, Grandpa sat with his friends around the fire pit. Their faces were lit by the flames, their voices low but steady. Hank spoke first. "We faced worse bullies than her, but the difference is we don't let bullies keep power. We take it back." Another veteran, Edna, chimed in. "If she wants to play by the rules, then let's play. Elections are due. Let's give the community a choice." I leaned back in my chair listening, realizing that this was no longer just about Grandpa. This was about every homeowner who'd ever been pushed around by Karen's clipboard, and in that moment, the plan began to form. By the end of the week, we had allies. Neighbors who'd stayed silent were now whispering support. People who'd paid unfair fines, who'd been humiliated in meetings, who'd watched Karen bully them into submission, they all began to step forward. Karen thought she was tightening her grip. What she didn't see was that she was building the very army that would unseat her. And here's the cliffhanger for Chapter 2. The night before the community meeting, I found a document tucked under my door. No note, no signature, just a photocopy of an HOA financial report. And on it, clear as day, were line items that didn't add up, thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Karen wasn't just overstepping, she was stealing. Would you consider an old truck non-compliant, or is that HOA overreach? Do you think the veterans should go straight to the election or expose the financials first? Have you ever seen an HOA president act like a dictator? I've seen storms roll across the lake before, dark clouds pushing low, wind turning, the water into a frenzy. But nothing I'd seen out there matched the storm brewing inside our little retirement village. That night, when I slid the anonymous financial report out of its envelope, my heart thudded like a war drum. The numbers didn't lie. HOA dues collected, over $200,000. Maintenance projects, listed at $75,000. But here's the thing. Our neighborhood had no new maintenance, no repaved roads, no fresh paint on the clubhouse, no landscaping upgrades, nothing. So where was the money going? The next morning, I brought the papers to Grandpa's porch. He squinted through his glasses, lips pressed thin. Looks like somebody's been paying themselves a little too much. He wasn't wrong. One line item was labeled administrative miscellaneous at nearly $30,000. Another, board expenses, swallowed up another 20 grand. And who signed off on it all? Karen. Here's where the story turned into something much bigger than one man's flag or one woman's clipboard. This was fraud, pure and simple, but we needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence. And that's where Grandpa's military friends came in. Hank, the drill sergeant type, slammed his fist on the table. We didn't spend years fighting overseas just to come home and get shaken down by a petty dictator. If she's stealing, we're bringing her down the right way. Edna leaned forward, her voice sharp but steady. We form a coalition. We gather every bit of evidence. We don't just take her down, we make sure she can never crawl her way back into power. I glanced around at the circle of veterans, their faces lit with the same determination I'd seen in old photographs of them in uniform. This wasn't just a group of retirees anymore. This was an organized unit, and their new mission was clear. The following days felt like living in a spy novel. One neighbor, Bill, used to be an accountant. He offered to go through years of HOA, financial records, combing through every dollar. Another neighbor, Marcia, who'd worked as a legal secretary, volunteered to draft formal requests for documents. Meanwhile, Hank and I started knocking on doors, quietly rallying support. What we discovered stunned us. For 3 years, Karen had been writing checks to a company called Lakeside Consulting Services. Sounds official, right? But when Bill traced the address, it wasn't a business at all. It was Karen's cousin's house, 2 towns over. Folks, this wasn't petty HOA revenge anymore. This was embezzlement, plain, ugly theft. Now here's a question for you all watching. If you discovered your HOA president was stealing your money, would you go straight to the police, or would you build a case to take them down publicly? I want to know, because this decision split our group right down the middle. Grandpa wanted justice, but he wanted it clean. We expose her in front of the whole neighborhood, he said. No backroom deals, no private calls to the cops. She humiliated me publicly. Let's see how she likes it. And that became our battle plan. We weren't just going to file complaints, we were going to hold an election, a proper one. And when the ballots were cast, we'd bring out the evidence for all to see. Karen, meanwhile, must have sensed something, was changing. She doubled down, issuing even more fines. One neighbor was written up for excessive bird feeders, another for having a potted plant that clashed with the aesthetic. And for Grandpa, the blows kept coming. She fined him for non-uniform mail receptacles because his mailbox flag had been painted by my late grandmother decades ago. A little red heart with her initials, something sweet, harmless, personal. When Grandpa got that notice, I swear his eyes glistened. Not from sadness, but from anger so deep it rattled me. She's not just fining me, he said quietly. She's erasing my history, my memories, my wife. That was the moment I realized. This fight wasn't just about money or power. It was about dignity, about preserving what mattered. The community meeting loomed closer, and here's where pattern interrupt number 2 hit. 2 days before the meeting, Karen sent out a letter to every resident. In it, she accused Grandpa of being a chronic rule-breaker, claiming he had disrupted neighborhood harmony and set a poor example for residents. She ended it with this line: "If he cannot respect our standards, perhaps this community is no longer the right place for him." Folks, can you imagine opening your mailbox to find your 90-year-old grandfather being publicly shamed in writing? I want to know, should there be legal consequences for that kind of slander? But here's the twist. Karen's attempt to shame him backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Grandpa, the letter united the neighborhood. Neighbors who'd stayed silent showed up on his porch, clutching their own letters with disgust written on their faces. "I got fined for my Christmas lights," one said. "She charged me for my rose garden," another whispered. She threatened me with foreclosure over a fence, a third added. By the end of the night, there were 30 people packed into Grandpa's yard, 30 angry, fed up, homeowners, tired of Karen's tyranny. And when Grandpa stood, raising his voice just enough to carry, he said, "Then let's show her what democracy looks like." The porch erupted in applause. The night of the meeting, the air felt electric. The clubhouse was packed wall to wall, folding chairs scraping against linoleum, whispers buzzing like hornets. Karen sat at the head of the table, clipboard in hand, lips pursed tight. She looked smug, like she believed she'd already won, but in my pocket were the financial documents, proof of her theft, proof of her lies, proof that her crown was made of paper. And just as the meeting began, Hank leaned over to me and whispered, "Get ready. Tonight the Queen loses her throne. Would you have taken this straight to the police or waited to expose her publicly? Do you think Karen's letter was slander or just an opinion? What would you do if your HOA was secretly stealing thousands of dollars?" The clubhouse had never been this full. Normally, HOA meetings drew maybe a handful of folks, whoever was bored enough or unlucky enough to be cornered by Karen. But that night, nearly every seat was filled. Retirees with folded arms, neighbors shifting in their chairs, veterans standing like sentinels at the back. The air buzzed like static before a lightning strike. Karen sat at the head of the table, clipboard resting in front of her like a gavel. She wore a stiff smile, but I could see it, the tightness around her jaw, the way her fingers drummed against the pen. She knew something was coming. "Let's call this meeting to order," she began, her voice sharp, practiced, too rehearsed. "First item on the agenda, violations." She glanced down the list. Mr. Robert Lane, that was Grandpa. Multiple infractions, including non-compliant flag size, unauthorized porch furniture, and, she smirked here, graffiti on mailbox. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Graffiti? The little red heart my grandmother painted decades ago? Karen had reduced it to graffiti. Grandpa stood slowly, 90 years old, but his presence filled the room. That heart was painted by my late wife. It's not graffiti, it's love. The room fell quiet. Even those who'd come skeptical leaned forward, listening. Karen rolled her eyes. Sentimental value doesn't override community standards. The rules are clear. If you can't, follow them, perhaps. Perhaps you're not fit to lead us, Hank's voice boomed from the back. Head snapped around. Hank stepped forward, shoulders squared, holding a stack of papers. "Because according to these bylaws," he slapped the folder down on the table, "you were never elected, which means every fine, every penalty, every humiliation you've handed down has no legal standing." The room erupted in whispers. Karen's face flushed. That's a lie. I was appointed after Mr. Wilkins passed away." Bill, the accountant neighbor, rose next. Calm, methodical, he adjusted his glasses. "Appointed, yes, but not elected, and the bylaws require an election every year. You skipped 2. That means you are not the HOA president. You're just a resident with a clipboard. Now, folks, let me pause here and ask you, should Karen be forced to repay all the fines she issued illegally? Or should she face even steeper consequences? Drop your thoughts. I know this will get heated in the comments." Karen stammered, her mask cracking. This is nonsense. I've done everything by the book." That was my cue. I stood, pulling the financial reports from my folder. "Funny you should say that, Karen, because according to the actual books, you've been writing checks to a company called Lakeside Consulting Services, tens of thousands of dollars, and guess what? That company doesn't exist unless you count your cousin's house 2 towns over." The room exploded. People shouted, gasped, stood to their feet. Some demanded explanations, others just stared in shock. Karen's face went pale, then blotchy red. That's private information. You had no right." "We had every right," Edna snapped, rising from her seat. "Those are our dues, our money, and you've been stealing it. That's not leadership, that's theft." At that moment, the clubhouse shifted. The fear Karen had wielded like a weapon was gone. What replaced it was outrage. Power was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she knew it. "Call the vote!" someone shouted from the back. "Yes, let's vote her out!" another echoed. Karen banged the table with her pen. "You can't just, this meeting isn't authorized." But Hank cut her off. "This meeting is authorized by the very people you've been exploiting, and tonight, you're finished." The vote was swift. Neighbors lined up, scribbling their choices on slips of paper. Hank, Edna, and Bill tallied them at the front, while the room buzzed with nervous energy. I glanced at Grandpa, who sat quietly, pride softening his weathered features. When the final count was read, the result was undeniable. Karen, 3 votes. Community Coalition, 47 votes. She was out. But here's where the story takes its third pattern interrupt. As the room erupted in cheers, Karen didn't shrink back in shame. She stood, slamming her clipboard against the table. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You think you've won, but I'll fight you every step of the way. And I've got lawyers, expensive ones." Her voice cracked at the edges, but her eyes blazed with fury. She wasn't done. "Not yet, folks. Here's a question for you. Do you think Karen should face criminal charges for embezzlement, or is losing her position enough? I want to hear your verdict, because what happened next had us all divided." After the meeting, we walked Grandpa home. His porch light glowed softly against the lake, reflecting off the water. He looked tired, but there was a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in weeks. "They tried to bury me in shame," he said, voice low but steady. "But tonight we dug the truth out." Hank clapped him on the back. "And tomorrow we bury her. In justice." The war wasn't over. Karen still had cards to play, lawyers, threats, intimidation, but the tide had turned. For the first time, the community wasn't afraid of her. And as I looked around at the neighbors gathered on Grandpa's porch, I knew the final battle was coming. Should Karen be forced to repay all the fines she issued illegally? Do you think she deserves criminal charges, or was losing power enough? Have you ever been to an HOA meeting that turned into a full-blown showdown? The night after the election, you could feel the village breathe easier. For the first time in years, people decorated their porches without fear. Wind chimes jingled freely, bird feeders swung from branches, and flags, big and small, fluttered proudly in the lakeside breeze. But peace wasn't permanent. Not yet. 2 days later, thick envelopes arrived in several of our mailboxes. I tore mine open at the kitchen table and nearly laughed. It was a cease and desist letter from Karen's lawyer. According to the letter, we had defamed her character by spreading false accusations of theft and mismanagement. She demanded an apology, reinstatement as president, and financial compensation for emotional distress. I carried the letter straight to Grandpa's porch. He was already sitting with Hank and Edna, envelopes spread across the table. Hank was red in the face, Edna's lips thin with fury. "She's cornered," Hank muttered, "and a cornered bully bites back." Grandpa leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "Son, I've dealt with worse threats. They're just words. But if she wants to fight in court, then let her. The truth's on our side." Here's where the veterans' discipline really showed. They didn't panic. They didn't cave. Instead, they went into action. Bill, the accountant, filed a formal complaint with the county auditor's office. Marcia, the legal secretary, sent copies of the financial records to the state's Department of Consumer Affairs. And Hank drove down to the courthouse with a stack of affidavits signed by residents who had been unfairly fined. Karen had her expensive lawyers. We had the truth, and an army of veterans who refused to back down. Weeks dragged on. Letters flew back and forth. Karen strutted around like she still held power, warning neighbors that justice was coming, and they'd all be sorry. But what she didn't know was that the real storm was gathering behind her. One crisp autumn morning, a knock rattled Karen's front door. Not from neighbors, not from us, but from 2 county investigators in gray suits. They carried clipboards, official seals, and the kind of authority no clipboard queen could argue with. By noon, word spread like wildfire. Karen's finances were under investigation. Folks, let me pause and ask you, do you think HOA boards should be audited more often, or was this karma catching up at just the right time? Drop your thoughts. I know some of you have stories of your own HOAs mishandling money. Karen tried to spin it. She told anyone who'd listen that it was a misunderstanding, that the veterans had framed her, that her hard work was being twisted. But the community wasn't buying it. Too many of us had suffered under her petty reign. Too many wallets had been drained, too many memories trampled, and when the auditors returned, they carried boxes of evidence showing misused funds, falsified invoices, and years of skimming money straight into Karen's pockets. The final verdict came down. The whole neighborhood seemed to gather outside the clubhouse. Even the lake was still, as if waiting. The county announced that Karen had embezzled nearly $80,000 in HOA funds. She was ordered to repay every cent, plus penalties. She was barred from ever holding a board position in any HOA again. And yes, she faced criminal charges. When the news hit, the clubhouse erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged, veterans saluted. Grandpa just sat quietly, eyes misty, flag waving behind him on the porch. "Justice," he whispered. "Not revenge, justice." Karen tried one last time to save face. She marched to Grandpa's porch, reporters trailing behind her. Microphones shoved in her face. "This is harassment," she snapped. "I've been treated unfairly. This whole neighborhood turned against me because of one old man and his flag." Grandpa stood slowly, steadying himself on his cane. He looked her dead in the eye, voice calm but firm. "Mom, I fought for the right to fly that flag, and you tried to take it from me. But what you really took was this community's trust. And trust, once lost, is never given back." The reporters scribbled furiously. Karen's face crumpled, her fury collapsing into embarrassment. She stormed away, her empire of fines and clipboards reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. Life slowly returned to peace. The veterans officially restructured the HOA, this time with regular elections and full transparency. Bill handled the finances, Edna chaired meetings with fairness, and Hank made sure no rule was enforced without community input. Grandpa? He kept flying his flag. And every morning, just after sunrise, his friends gathered on his porch. 20 old soldiers saluting quietly as the stars and stripes caught the first light of day. It wasn't just about the flag anymore. It was about dignity, about community, about standing together when one person tried to tear us apart. And now, I'll turn to you, the viewers. Would you want veterans like Grandpa and his friends running your HOA, or do you think HOAs should be abolished altogether? Have you ever seen karma hit a bully as hard as it hit Karen? And here's the prediction question. How long do you think Karen lasted in that town after all this? Karen's downfall became the talk of the county. For months, neighbors would smile knowingly when they passed Grandpa's porch, saluting.